Emily Harper's hands were bleeding before the sun had fully risen. She drove that shovel into the earth again. Alone, 16 years old, cast out like trash on the side of a dirt road. And she did not cry. Not once. She just dug. Because no one was coming to save her, and she knew it. This is the story of a girl they threw away, and the home she built that made them all ashamed. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel, follow Emily's journey all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning her father threw her out, Emily Harper had been awake since before the roosters. She'd heard the voices through the thin wall, her father's low, certain tone, and a man she didn't recognize, speaking in the careful, measured cadence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. She pressed herself against the wall and listened, the floorboards cold and rough under her bare feet. "She's 16, the stranger said. "Old enough. My first wife was 14 when we married. Gave me 4 boys before she passed." "She's strong," her father said. "Stubborn, but strong. You'll need someone who can keep up with a ranch that size." "What's she look like?" A pause. Emily didn't breathe. "Plain enough," her father said, "but she works harder than most men I know." Emily stepped back from the wall. Her chest felt like something had cracked inside it. Not broken clean, just fractured. The kind of hurt that doesn't bleed, but aches for years. She moved to the window and looked out at the flat, golden prairie, stretching to the horizon in every direction. The summer heat already shimmering off the dry grass, even before full sunrise. She knew, in that moment, exactly what was coming. She had 40 minutes to decide what to do about it. She was downstairs when her father came in from the porch. He didn't look her in the eye right away. That told her everything she needed to know. "Emily," he said. "Don't." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. He finally looked at her. "You don't even know what I was going to say. You were going to tell me I'm marrying a man I've never met." She set her coffee cup down on the table, careful and deliberate. "A man who asked what I looked like before he asked my name." Her father's jaw tightened. "Harlan Whitfield is a prosperous man. He owns 300 acres over near Coldwater Creek. You'd have a real house, Emily. A kitchen. Safety. Safety." She repeated the word like she was turning it over in her hands, checking it for cracks. "You mean his safety, his comfort, his legacy." "I mean your future." "That ain't my future, Papa. That's a sale." The silence that fell between them was long enough to be its own kind of answer. "You will do what this family needs you to do," he said, and his voice had gone hard. "Or you will leave this house today." Emily looked at her father, really looked at him, maybe for the last time, and she felt something settle inside her. Not peace exactly, more like the moment before a door swings shut and latches. "Then I'll leave," she said. She was out the door in under 20 minutes. Her mother stood at the far end of the yard, arms crossed, face unreadable. She didn't move to stop Emily. She didn't say a word. That hurt worse than anything her father had said. Emily walked past her with her chin up and her jaw locked tight, a flour sack over her shoulder with everything she'd been able to grab. 2 dresses, a wool blanket, her mother's old sewing kit, a half loaf of bread, and the tin box she kept beneath the floorboard in her room. She didn't look back. She walked the main road out of Dunmore until the town was just a smudge of rooftops behind her, and then she stopped in the middle of the road and opened the tin box. $193. Every penny she'd earned over 4 years of taking in laundry, mending clothes, and selling eggs at the Saturday market. She counted it twice, then closed the box and tucked it back under the bread. $193, a sack of belongings, and the prairie in every direction. She started walking. By mid-morning, she had reached the far edge of the Caldwell River bottomland, a stretch of scrubby cottonwoods and tall grass that nobody had bothered to homestead yet. The river ran low in summer, just a braided channel of clear water through sand and gravel. But it was there, and it was reliable, and the ground along the bank was soft enough to dig. Emily stood at the edge of the drop-off and looked down at the bottomland and thought, "This will do." She didn't have a horse. She didn't have tools beyond the short-handled spade she'd taken from the garden shed on her way out. She didn't have a map, or a deed, or a neighbor within 2 miles who knew her name. She had her own 2 hands and a clear morning, and the absolute certainty that she was not going back. She climbed down the bank and started walking the ground, pressing her heel into the dirt to test it, pulling up handfuls of grass to check the root depth, checking the angle of the slope toward the river. Her father had taught her that much, at least, how to read land. She'd always paid closer attention than he'd known. She found a spot where the bank curved slightly inland, giving a natural windbreak on 2 sides. The grass was shorter here, the soil darker and denser beneath the surface layer of sod. She knelt down and dug her fingers in up to the second knuckle. "That'll hold," she said aloud, to no one. She was 2 hours into cutting sod bricks when she heard the horse. She knew who it was before she looked up. There was only one man in the county who rode a palomino that color: Jack Whitman, second son of Thomas Whitman, who owned the grain mill and half the dry goods in Dunmore. Jack was 19, broad-shouldered, and had spent his entire life being told he was the smartest person in any room he entered. He pulled up at the edge of the drop-off and looked down at her. "Emily Harper," he said, like her name was the punchline to a joke he'd already heard. "What in the world are you doing down there?" "Working." She didn't look up. "Working." He said it the same way she'd said safety to her father that morning. Turning it over, looking for the absurdity. "You're cutting sod bricks." "That's correct." "By yourself." "Also correct?" A pause. She heard him shift in the saddle. "You running away from home, Harper?" She set down a sod brick, straightened, and finally looked up at him. "I was asked to leave. There's a difference." Something moved across his face. Not quite sympathy, not quite mockery. He settled on amusement, because that was the safest place for Jack Whitman to land. "And so your plan is what exactly? Build yourself a house down in the bottomland like a river rat?" "A sod house," she said. "Semi-subterranean. The earth keeps the temperature stable. It'll be cooler inside than any wood frame house in this county when that heat breaks in July." He stared at her for a long moment. "You're serious," he said. "I'm always serious." She picked up her spade and went back to work. "You're welcome to keep watching, or you're welcome to leave. Either way, I've got bricks to cut." He left. She kept cutting. By the time the sun was directly overhead, she had 43 sod bricks laid out in rows to dry, and a trench dug roughly 8 feet long and 6 feet wide, going down nearly 3 feet into the earth. Her arms ached from the shoulder to the fingertips. Her shirt was soaked through with sweat, and her boots were caked with dark river-bottom mud. She sat on the edge of the trench and ate half of the bread from her sack, and drank river water from her cupped hands, and looked at what she'd done. 43 bricks. A hole in the ground. Barely the beginning. "You gonna make it," she said quietly, to herself, the way she'd always talked herself through hard things. "You've done harder than this. You just haven't known it yet." She went back to work. The trouble came that afternoon in the form of Reverend Collins. He arrived on foot. He always walked, said it kept him humble, with his hat in one hand and his Bible in the other, picking his way down the bank toward her with the careful steps of a man who did not trust uneven ground. "Miss Harper," he said, Word travels fast in Dunmore. I imagine it does. She didn't stop working. Your father is concerned. She looked up at that. My father sold me to a cattle rancher this morning and threatened me with the door if I objected. I'm having some trouble locating his concern, Reverend. Collins clasped his hands around the Bible. He was a decent man. She'd always believed that. Decent, but cautious in the way that decent men sometimes were, always weighing propriety against principle and finding propriety easier to carry. You are a young woman alone on unclaimed land, he said. That is a dangerous situation. It's a situation I created for myself, and I intend to manage it myself. Emily. He lowered his voice, and for a moment he sounded less like the Reverend and more like the man who'd once given her a penny candy at Christmas when she was small. Be reasonable. Come back to town. Stay with the deaconess until something more suitable can be arranged. She drove her spade into the earth and leaned on the handle and looked at him straight. Reverend Collins, how many women have been told to be reasonable when what they actually needed was to be believed? He opened his mouth, closed it. I'm not asking for help, she said. I'm not asking for rescue. I'm asking to be left alone to do what I know I can do. If that's not something you can support, then I respect your walk back up that bank. He stood there a long time. Then he put his hat back on, slow and deliberate. I'll pray for you, he said. I'd appreciate that. She picked up her spade again. God and a solid work ethic aren't mutually exclusive. She heard him climb the bank behind her. She heard his footsteps fade. And then there was nothing but the sound of her spade and the river and the dry prairie wind. She worked until the light gave out. By dark, she had the trench dug to depth, 3.5 feet down, 8 by 10 feet across, wider than she'd originally planned because she'd found a change in the soil composition about 2 feet in that she wanted to work with rather than against. The walls were solid. The floor was tamped flat. She'd set 67 sod bricks to dry on the bank above. She slept that night in the trench itself, wrapped in her blanket, with her flour sack under her head, the walls of earth rising on either side of her, and the open sky above, wide and thick with stars. It was the strangest feeling, lying in a hole she'd dug with her own hands, in a life she'd built in a single day, with no one's permission and no one's help. It felt like freedom. The uncomfortable kind. The real kind. The second day was harder. She woke before dawn with her back screaming from sleeping on bare ground, and both her hands blistered down to open sores. She rewrapped them with strips cut from the hem of her spare dress, drank water from the river, and went back to work. She needed wood for the roof frame. Sod alone couldn't span 8 feet without support. She spent the first 2 hours of morning walking the riverbank, dragging out cottonwood branches that had come down in the last spring flood, assessing them for length and strength. She was on her third haul when she heard someone behind her. "Those branches are green," said a woman's voice. "They'll bow under the weight of the sod before first frost." Emily turned. She knew Mrs. Palmer by reputation more than acquaintance. Widowed 3 years ago, ran a small market garden on the north edge of town, known for being plain-spoken to the point of tactlessness, and for making the best salt-cured pork in the county. Mrs. Palmer stood on the bank above, looking down at the pile of branches with the expression of someone reviewing work that didn't quite pass muster. "I know they're green," Emily said. "I don't have dry timber." "No." Mrs. Palmer reached into the large basket she was carrying and produced a bundle wrapped in canvas. "But I do." She nodded toward the bundle. 6 good cedar poles, dry-cured 2 years, left over from when I built my smokehouse. A pause. "I also brought bread and a jar of my good honey, Because you look like you haven't had a proper meal since yesterday morning." Emily looked at her. For one terrible, unguarded moment, she felt the back of her throat go tight. "Why?" she asked. Her voice came out rough. Mrs. Palmer looked at her steadily. "Because I was 22 when my husband's family told me I was too stubborn to be worth helping. And I spent 6 months proving them right, when I should have spent that time building something better." She set the basket down and began climbing carefully down the bank. "I'm not here to take over your project, girl. I'm here to bring you cedar poles and honey and mind my own business while you figure the rest out yourself." Emily let out a long, slow breath. "Thank you, ma'am," she said. "Don't thank me yet." Mrs. Palmer set the cedar poles down on the flat ground and looked at the trench and the stacked sawed bricks and the tools laid out in neat order. And for just a moment, her expression changed. Something that might, on a different kind of face, have been admiration. "You're building it into the slope," she said. "That's smart. Most people build flat and then wonder why the heat gets in." "The earth holds the temperature," Emily said. "If I go 3 feet down and bank the exterior walls with sod 2 feet thick, it'll stay close to 65 degrees inside all summer. Maybe cooler." Mrs. Palmer was quiet for a moment. Then, "Who taught you that?" "I read it." Emily picked up a cedar pole and tested its weight. "I read everything I could get my hands on." Mrs. Palmer opened the canvas bundle and laid out the poles in order of length. "Your father know you could think like this?" "My father," Emily said carefully, "had other plans for me." Mrs. Palmer made a sound low in her throat. Not quite words, but the kind of sound that carried entire sentences in it. She picked up a measuring cord from Emily's tool pile without asking, and began marking off pole lengths. "Then his loss," she said simply. "Now show me your wall layout. We've got work to do before that afternoon heat sets in." By the end of the second day, the wall framing was up. 6 cedar poles, set in pairs at each end and the center, lashed with cord and notched to interlock. Emily had spent 3 hours cutting and setting the first course of sod wall bricks above the trench line. Thick, dense, stacked grass side down the way she'd read, so the roots would knit the wall together as they dried. Mrs. Palmer had worked alongside her for 4 hours before packing up her basket and making the walk back to town without ceremony or fanfare. "Same time tomorrow," was all she'd said. "You don't have to. I know I don't have to." Mrs. Palmer climbed the bank without looking back. "That's why I said, same time tomorrow." Emily stood alone in the long, late afternoon shadow of her half-built walls and looked at what 2 days had produced. The framing was straight. The walls were going up solid and true. The floor of the trench was smooth and level. Nobody had given this to her. Nobody had built it for her. She had found it in the earth with her own hands and her own mind, and the stubborn certainty that she was worth more than whatever price her father had tried to put on her. She sat down on the edge of her trench and looked out at the flat gold prairie and the wide burning sky and the river catching the last copper light of evening. She was 16 years old, alone, and building something from nothing. And somewhere, underneath the exhaustion and the blisters and the ache in every muscle of her body, deep and quiet and absolutely certain, she was not afraid. The third day started with a problem. Emily heard them before she saw them. 2 men, voices carrying across the flat morning air with the easy carelessness of people who didn't think they needed to lower them. She set down her water pail and listened. "County assessor's office doesn't have a claim filed on it, that much I know." "Then it's open land. She's squatting." "She's a minor is what she is. 16 years old, no guardian, no deed. Her daddy could haul her back if he wanted." Emily walked to the base of the bank and looked up. 2 men she didn't know, one heavyset, wearing the kind of dusty coat that said traveling businessman, the other younger, holding a surveyor's rod like he'd been told to look official. Behind them, sitting his palomino at a careful distance, was Jack Whitman. He wasn't speaking. He was watching. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Emily said. The heavy-set man looked down at her with the particular expression of someone who had already decided what they were going to find before they arrived. "Miss Harper, is it? I'm Gerald Pratt. I represent a land interest group out of Wichita. This bottomland parcel you're occupying, it hasn't been filed on." "I'm aware of that." She climbed the bank, moving steady and unhurried. "I intend to file this week." "Well now, that's the interesting thing." Pratt smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. "My clients already have an interest in this parcel. They've been looking at river bottomland along this stretch for a development project. Grain storage, most likely." He glanced at her trench and her sod walls with something approaching theatrical pity. "You've done some digging, I see. That's unfortunate. You'll have to fill it back in." Emily looked at him for a long moment. "I'm going to need to see your documentation," she said. Pratt blinked. That wasn't the response he'd been expecting. "I beg your pardon?" "Your documentation. Your client's prior claim. Whatever filing they have with the county assessor's office." She folded her arms across her chest. "Because an interest in land and a filed claim on land are two different things, Mr. Pratt. And I've read enough about the Homestead Act to know which one carries legal weight." Silence. The younger man with the surveyor's rod glanced at Pratt. Pratt's smile thinned out. "You're a sharp girl, Miss Harper."
"Yes, sir, I am."
She didn't move. "Your documentation?"
"I don't carry documents in the field."
"Then until I see a legitimate prior claim filed with the Douglas County Assessor's Office, I will continue building my home on this land." She met his eyes without blinking.
"You're welcome to pursue the proper legal channels. That's what they're there for."
Pratt looked at her for a long moment. The kind of look that was calculating rather than angry, which was worse. Then he touched the brim of his hat in the mockery of a courtesy and turned back toward his horse. "We'll be in touch, Miss Harper," he said.
"I'll be here,"
she said. She watched them ride out. When she finally turned, Jack Whitman hadn't left. He sat his palomino 20 yards off, and for once his face wasn't arranged into its customary amusement. He was looking at her with something she couldn't quite name. "How do you know about the Homestead Act?" he asked.
"I told you, I read."
She started back down the bank. "Did you bring them out here, Jack?" A pause that lasted one beat too long. "No." She stopped, looked back up at him. "But you knew they were coming." He didn't answer, which was its own answer. She went back to work. Mrs. Palmer arrived at her usual time, read Emily's face the way experienced women read weather, and said nothing for the first half hour. They worked side by side in the particular comfortable silence of two people who have established a rhythm, setting the second course of the sod walls, tamping and leveling. Finally, Mrs. Palmer said, "You had visitors this morning." "Word travels fast." "It's Dunmore." She pressed a sod brick into place with both palms. "Gerald Pratt. He's done this before. Comes into a county, identifies unclaimed parcels, tries to pressure off whoever's already there before they can file. Done it 4-5 times that I know of." Emily's hands stilled. "Has he ever been stopped?" "Once." Mrs. Palmer's voice was dry. "A farmer over near Kinsley. Had a neighbor who was a retired judge. Pratt took one look at that situation and decided his grain storage could go somewhere else." She glanced sideways at Emily. "You don't have a retired judge." "No." Emily picked up her brick and set it. But I have until the end of the week to get to the county seat and file. It's 40 miles. I know how far it is. Mrs. Palmer was quiet for a moment. You can't walk 40 miles and leave your work unprotected. I know that too. Emily straightened and looked at the walls. 4 courses up now, solid and true. The sod bricks knitting together in the heat, just the way she'd read they would. The roof framing was holding. Another 2 days of wall work, and she could start on the roof layer. She was close. She was genuinely, actually close. I need to borrow a horse, she said. Mrs. Palmer didn't look at her. My mare is 15 years old and doesn't like strangers. Then come with me. Now Mrs. Palmer did look at her. Emily met her gaze straight on. I'll drive, Emily said. I just need your horse and your buggy and someone who knows where the county assessor's office is. It's a day there and a day back. We can leave at first light tomorrow and be back before Pratt can do anything he can't undo. The older woman studied her for a long moment. Then she went back to setting her brick. First light, she said finally. And you'd better know how to drive a buggy. I've been driving since I was 9. Good. Then stop talking and set your bricks. They were 2 miles down the county road before Emily saw the rider behind them. She spotted him in the small, cracked mirror Mrs. Palmer had fixed to the buggy frame. Jack Whitman, hanging back far enough to pretend he wasn't following, close enough to make clear he was. She watched him for a full mile before she said anything. We have company. Mrs. Palmer didn't turn around. I see him. A beat. He's been behind us since we left the river road. Emily's jaw tightened. If he's going to Dunmore to warn Pratt... He's not going to Dunmore. Dunmore is north. He's heading southeast, same as us. Mrs. Palmer adjusted the reins with the calm of someone who had outlasted many more complicated situations than this one. Let him follow. You can't stop him being on a public road. What does he want? I imagine he wants to see how this plays out. A pause. Men like Jack Whitman don't know what to do with women who don't need them. Confuses them terribly. Sometimes they follow at a distance until they figure it out. Emily looked back at the mirror. Jack's Palomino kept its steady pace, neither closing nor dropping back. She turned forward and drove. The county seat was busier than Dunmore in the way that all official places are busy. People moving with purpose, but not urgency. The sound of voices and boot heels on board floors. The smell of paper and ink and old wood. Emily had never been inside a government office before. She walked in like she had, which was the important thing. The assessor's clerk was a young man with a careful mustache and ink on his fingers, who looked up from his ledger when she approached his counter, and did the thing men sometimes did when she walked into rooms. A quick, dismissive assessment. A decision made before she'd opened her mouth. "Help you?" he said, in a tone that communicated he doubted it. "I need to file a homestead claim," Emily said. 160 acres, river bottomland, Douglas County. Caldwell River section, South Bank, beginning at the 3rd Cottonwood Bend, east of the ford. She placed her money on the counter. The filing fee she'd calculated from the pamphlet she'd found 6 months ago in the back of the Dunmore Lending Library. The one she'd read 4 times on the walk home and twice more after. Filing fee. Correct amount. The clerk looked at the money. Looked at her. How old are you? He said. 18, she said, without blinking. Beside her, she felt Mrs. Palmer go very still. The clerk looked at her for a long moment. Emily held his gaze with the flat, steady patience of someone who had already decided how this was going to end and was simply waiting for the other person to catch up. I'll need your signature on the declaration form, the clerk said finally. He pulled a sheet from the drawer and set it on the counter with a pen. Emily signed her name in clear, unhesitating letters. She was back outside in 11 minutes with a receipt
and a filed claim number.
Mrs. Palmer said nothing until they were back in the buggy and 3 blocks from the courthouse. Then she said, "You lied to a federal employee." "I did." Emily kept her eyes on the road ahead. "That is technically a crime. So is turning a 16-year-old girl out onto the prairie with no resources and calling it family values." She kept driving. "I'll take my chances." Another silence. Then Mrs. Palmer made that low sound again, the one that carried entire sentences. And something around her mouth shifted that Emily had started to recognize as the closest the woman got to smiling. "Well," Mrs. Palmer said, "the claim is filed." The claim is filed. Jack Whitman caught up to them on the road home. He came up alongside the buggy at an easy trot and matched their pace without being invited to, which was such a fundamentally Jack Whitman thing to do that Emily felt irritation rise up in her chest like heat off summer asphalt. "Get your filing done?" he said. "That's not your business." "No." He rode in silence for a moment. "Pratt's going to find out. The assessor's office isn't quiet." "I know that." "He has resources, Emily. He's done this before." She looked at him then, sharp, direct. "How do you know what he's done before?" Jack's jaw moved. "My father has done business with him. In the past. Before I understood what kind of business it was." The buggy wheel hit a rut, and Emily steadied the reins without looking away from him. "And now that you understand?" He was quiet long enough that she almost turned away. Then, "My father told me about Pratt coming out to look at the bottomland 3 weeks ago. I didn't think anything of it. I didn't know you were—" He stopped, started again. "I didn't know someone was going to be living there." "Someone is living there," Emily said. "I am." "I know." His voice had lost its usual easy polish. Something underneath it was rougher, less certain. "I know that now." She studied him for a moment longer. There was something almost painful in the way he was sitting his horse. Not quite shame, but its close neighbor. A man who had been raised to move through the world without accounting for who else was in it, learning for the first time that there was a cost to that. "Is your father involved with Pratt directly?" she asked. "I don't know, honestly." He met her eyes. "But I can find out." "Why would you do that?" The question landed between them and sat there. He didn't have a quick answer for it, and the fact that he didn't, the fact that he sat with the question instead of deflecting it, told her something. "Because what's happening to you isn't right," he said finally. "And I've been standing at a comfortable distance watching it happen, and I'm tired of how that feels." Mrs. Palmer, who had been silent and apparently deeply interested in the road ahead, said, Emily turned forward. She drove another quarter-mile before she said anything. "Find out what your father knows," she said, "and don't tell him you're asking." "Understood." "And Jack?" She kept her eyes on the road. "If I find out you're playing both sides of this, I will make certain every woman in Dunmore knows exactly who Gerald Pratt is and exactly who helped him." She paused. "Women talk, especially in small towns, especially to each other." Jack was quiet for a moment, then, surprisingly, "Fair enough." He pulled back and let the buggy move ahead. Emily didn't look back. They were home before dark. The claim was filed. The receipt was folded in her tin box, and the sod walls were exactly where she'd left them, solid and untouched. The earth holding its shape the way the earth had always held, patient and indifferent to the opinions of men. But the next morning, Emily came down the bank and stopped. Someone had pulled out 6 of her cedar roof poles. They lay scattered on the ground below the wall line, some of them cracked. One split entirely down the grain. The work she and Mrs. Palmer had spent half a day securing was wrecked. Not by storm, not by accident. The poles had been pulled out with deliberate force. She could see the scrape marks in the wood, where a tool had been used to lever them free. She stood very still and looked at the damage for a long moment. Then she picked up the split pole, turned it in her hands, and studied the break. "Pine wedge," she said aloud. "They used a pine wedge and a mallet." She set it down, which means they came prepared, which means it wasn't a warning. It was a demonstration. She straightened up, and her voice was completely level when she said to the empty bottomland, the river, the wide, indifferent sky, "All right, then." She pulled her tin box from the flour sack and counted out what she had left after the filing. They were carrying things, blankets and pails and wrapped bundles, and two of them between them were managing a long section of dry timber that had clearly come from someone's outbuilding. Mrs. Palmer was at the front. She looked at the wrecked poles on the ground, and her expression went flat and cold. "We heard," she said simply. Emily opened her mouth and found, for the first time in 3 days, that she didn't have words ready. "Don't say anything foolish like you don't need help," said the widow Hensley, who had the broad, practical hands of a woman who had fixed her own fence and salted her own pork for 30 years. "We know you don't need it. We're giving it anyway." "Because this," Mrs. Palmer gestured at the scattered poles, the deliberate wreckage, "is not about you anymore. This is Pratt telling all of us what he thinks he can do in this county, to any of us, whenever he decides it's convenient." Emily looked at the 6 women on the bank above her. The morning light was hitting them from behind, and they were just shapes against the bright sky. 6 ordinary women in work dresses and sensible boots, carrying timber and determination. She felt something shift inside her chest. Not the cracking of the morning her father had spoken about selling her. Something different. Something opening rather than closing. "Well," she said, and her voice came out steady, "I guess we better get to work." The widow Hensley was already climbing down the bank. "That's the first sensible thing I've heard from you," she said pleasantly. They worked through the heat of the morning and into the afternoon. 6 women and a 16-year-old girl who had started with a spade and a tin box and a piece of land that nobody had wanted until she decided she did. The roof frame went back up stronger than before, the replacement timber better seasoned than the poles that had been destroyed. Somebody produced a tin of cold cornbread and a jar of sweet tea, and they ate, sitting on the tamped earth floor of the trench in the shade of the rising walls. Emily ate and listened to the women around her talk about their gardens, their families, the summer heat, the price of dry goods at Whitman's mill. Ordinary talk. The kind that carries a community through years, the way river water carries stone, smoothing and shaping without announcement. Nobody asked her what she was going to do about Pratt. Nobody told her it was going to be all right. They just stayed. And in Emily Harper's experience, staying was the thing that mattered. Anyone could show up for the beginning of something. It was staying through the middle, through the wrecked roof poles and the hot, dusty afternoons, and the parts where nothing was certain, that told you who people actually were. She looked at the walls going up around her, solid and certain, and thought, this is what a home actually is. Not 4 walls and a deed, not a man's name above a door. It was this: people deciding together that something was worth the effort, and then putting in the effort, even when it was hard, even when it was inconvenient, even when someone had gone out of their way to make it harder. She drove a cedar peg into the notch of the roof frame and felt its seat solid and true. Outside, it was 104 degrees. Inside, it was 66. She stood there alone for a full minute, hand against the wall, eyes closed, just feeling it, Then she picked up her water pail and went back to work. She had 3 more things to finish before she could call the structure complete. The door frame needed its second hinge. The ventilation channel she'd cut through the north wall needed a cover to keep out the field mice. And the floor needed 1 more tamping to flatten the section near the east wall that was still slightly uneven underfoot. She was working on the door hinge when Mrs. Palmer arrived, took 1 step inside, and stopped. The older woman stood very still. She didn't say anything for a long moment. "Well," she said finally. Her voice was different from usual, something careful in it, like she was keeping something else from coming out alongside the word. "You did it." "We did it," Emily said, and drove the hinge screw home. Mrs. Palmer made a small sound. Emily didn't look up, but she felt it. The particular weight of a person standing in a place and understanding, maybe for the first time, exactly how real it was. "The temperature," Mrs. Palmer said. 66. I checked twice." Emily moved to the Henderson's youngest, Tommy, he's 7, had heat sickness twice last summer. Martha Henderson can barely afford the doctor's fees as it is. "I know." "And old Mr. Briggs, who lives in that tin-roofed shack on the south end, he's—" "I know," Emily said again. She set down her driver and turned to face Mrs. Palmer directly. "I've been thinking about all of them. I've been thinking about it since the first night I slept in the trench and felt the earth hold 68 degrees while the air was over 90. She paused. "But I need to deal with Pratt first. Because if I don't hold this land, none of the rest of it matters." Mrs. Palmer nodded slowly. "Have you heard from Jack?" "Not yet. It's been 2 days since he said he'd look into his father's involvement." "I know." Emily picked up the driver again. "Either he's taking longer than expected, or he found something, and he's deciding what to do with it. Or his father found out he was asking and shut it down." That too. She went back to the hinge. "I'm not counting on Jack Whitman. I never was." But that was only half true, and some part of her knew it. He came that afternoon, not on his palomino this time, on foot, which meant he'd tied the horse somewhere and walked the last stretch, which meant he hadn't wanted anyone to see where he was going. Emily was working on the ventilation cover when she heard his boots on the bank above her and looked up. His face told her everything before he opened his mouth. Not fear exactly, but the look of a man who had learned something he couldn't unlearn and was still working out what to do with the weight of it. "My father," he said, and then stopped. Emily waited. "My father is not just doing business with Pratt." Jack came down the bank, stopping a few feet from her. He wasn't looking at the house, or at the land, or at anything except her. "He's the primary investor. He's been the one funding Pratt's operation across 3 counties. The grain storage angle, that was the public story. What they actually want the bottom land for is a mill expansion. They've been planning it for 18 months. He paused. "Before you were here, before any of this, they identified this parcel as the optimal site for a water-driven secondary mill and assumed they'd be able to acquire it quietly, the way they always do." Emily heard every word. She kept her face still. "The assessor's clerk," she said. "Did your father contact him after I filed?" Jack's jaw tightened. "Yes." "What did they offer him?" "I don't know the exact figure. Enough." She felt the anger move through her chest like a clean, cold current. Not hot anger. She'd learned a long time ago that hot anger made you stupid. This was the other kind, the kind that clarifies. "So the filing might not hold," she said. "I don't know. It depends on how far my father is willing to push it." Jack looked at her steadily. "I want to help you fight this, Emily. I mean that. But you need to understand what you're fighting.
This isn't just Pratt.
This is Thomas Whitman, and my father has been the most powerful man in this county for 20 years. And you're his son. And I'm his son. He said it without flinching. Who is standing here telling you what he knows. Make of that what you will. The silence between them stretched long enough to have weight. Why? She said. Not the same why she'd asked Mrs. Palmer on the first day. This one was different, harder, more specific. Jack was quiet for a moment. Because I watched you build this, he said. I rode out here every 2-3 days for 2 weeks, and I told myself I was just curious. I told myself it was amusing, watching the Harper girl dig herself a hole in the ground. He looked at the walls, at the finished structure, solid and precise and exactly what she'd said it would be. And then I watched you not fail. And I watched my father's man wreck your roof poles. And I watched you come back the next morning and fix it. And He stopped. I don't want to be the kind of man who watches something wrong happen because it's convenient to look away. I've been that man for 19 years. I'm tired of him. Emily looked at him for a long time. Can you get proof, she said, of your father's arrangement with the clerk? Something on paper. I know where he keeps his correspondence. That would be stealing. Yes. He held her gaze. It would. Another silence. Emily thought about 66 degrees against 104. She thought about the Hendersons' youngest son and Mr. Briggs in his tin-roofed shack. She thought about her mother standing in the yard, not moving and not speaking, while Emily walked away with everything she owned in a flour sack. Get the proof, she said. She had 18 hours. That was her best estimate of how long before Pratt made his next move. He'd been quiet for 3 days since the wrecked poles, which in her experience of difficult men meant he was done with demonstrations and moving toward something definitive. She spent those 18 hours doing 3 things. The first was visiting Reverend Collins. She found him in his church, which was cool in the way stone buildings were cool. And he looked up from his preparation notes with an expression that cycled through surprise, concern, and a careful kind of resignation, all in the space of about 2 seconds. Emily, he said. Reverend? She sat down across from him without waiting to be invited. I need you to listen to something, and I need you to not give me advice until I'm finished. He closed his notes. Go ahead. She told him everything. Pratt, her father's involvement with Whitman's business interests, the filing, what Jack had told her that afternoon. She told him without decoration or pause, the way she'd always said things when she meant them to be taken seriously. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. What is it you want from me? He said. Witnesses, she leaned forward. If Pratt or Whitman moves on my land in the next 48 hours, I need people who were told in advance what was happening and why. People whose word means something in this county. She looked at him steadily. Your word means something. Collins clasped his hands on his desk. Emily, your land claim was filed by a minor using a false age declaration. That is a legal vulnerability. I know that. If Pratt's lawyers move on that, I know, which is why I need other ground to stand on. Witnesses, documentation, the community on record. She held his eyes. I'm not asking you to lie for me, Reverend. I'm asking you to be present for what's true. He was quiet for a long moment. The afternoon light moved through the church windows, and Emily could hear the summer outside. The insects, the dry wind, the distant sounds of the town going about its business. I'll be present, he said at last. She stood. Thank you. Emily. He stopped her at the door. For what it's worth, what you've built down there. I've heard from a number of people who've been inside it. A pause. It is remarkable.
She looked back at him. "It works," she said. "That was all I needed it to do."
The second thing she did was find Gerald Pratt. She found him at the hotel dining room, at supper, eating alone, with papers spread beside his plate in the way of a man who had always used visible busyness as a signal of importance. She walked across the dining room without slowing, pulled out the chair across from him, and sat down. Pratt looked up. The expression that moved across his face was brief and complicated. Irritation, surprise, and beneath both of them, something she recognized as recalibration. He was updating his assessment of her. "Miss Harper," he said, "this is unexpected." "I imagine most things about me have been unexpected, Mr. Pratt." She folded her hands on the table. "I'd like to have a direct conversation." He leaned back, dabbing his mouth with his napkin, performing ease. "By all means." "Your principal investor is Thomas Whitman. Your actual purpose for this land is mill expansion, not grain storage. You have been operating this acquisition strategy across at least 3 counties in this state, and in at least one of those cases, you've had prior contact with the county assessor's clerk." She paused to let that sit. "I'm not guessing at any of that. I'm telling you what I know." The ease performance stopped. He looked at her across the table, and his eyes were flat and careful now. "You're a 16-year-old girl." "I'm the person who holds a filed homestead claim on the land you need," she said. "My age is only relevant if you're planning to use it against me. And if you're planning to use it against me, I want you to know that I will spend whatever it takes, time, money, and noise, making certain that every person in this county and the next one understands exactly how your business operates." She kept her voice pleasant. "I'm not easy to make quiet, Mr. Pratt. I suspect you've worked that out by now." Pratt set down his napkin with the precise movements of a man keeping himself controlled. "What do you want?" "I want you to withdraw your interest in my parcel." "That's not, and I want it in writing, delivered to Reverend Collins, who is acting as a community witness in this matter, by noon tomorrow." She stood. "If I don't have it by noon, I'll be filing a complaint with the State Land Office regarding your activities in this county and the 2 adjacent ones. I have documentation." She said the last sentence like she was certain of it, which was almost true. "Good evening." She walked out of the dining room without looking back. Her hands were shaking by the time she reached the street. She pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed and waited for them to stop. It took longer than she'd have liked. Jack came to her at first light. He came down the bank quietly, which she registered before she fully woke. She'd developed the particular light sleep of someone living alone in an unenclosed space, snapping to awareness at any footfall that wasn't wind or animal. She was sitting up before he reached the bottom. He was holding the leather document wallet. His face was composed, in a way that looked like it was costing him something. "I found 3 letters," he said, "between my father and the assessor. The first one references your claim by name. The second one includes a figure. The third—" he paused. "The third one is from my father to Pratt, dated the day after your filing, instructing him to, his exact words, resolve the Harper situation by whatever means are efficient." The words landed in the quiet morning air between them. "Whatever means are efficient," Emily repeated. "Yes." She reached out and took the wallet, opened it, looked at the letters, her father's business partner's handwriting, neat and authoritative, spelling out in 3 separate documents exactly what had been done and why, and with whose money. She closed the wallet. "Jack," she looked up at him, "your father is going to know these are gone." "I know that." "This will cost you considerably more than inconvenience." He met her eyes. "I know that too. She looked at him for a long moment. This 19-year-old boy who had ridden out to mock her on the first day, who had followed her at a distance to the county seat, who had stood in her finished sod house and felt the 66 degrees against the afternoon heat and understood, maybe for the first time in his life, that someone had been entirely right about something, and he had been entirely wrong. "Why?" she asked. It was the third time she'd asked him that question, and this time it meant something different from the other two. He looked at the walls of her sod house, at the neat cedar roof frame, at the tamped earth floor, at the ventilation channel and the solid door frame, and the structure that had been wrecked once and rebuilt stronger, and was still standing in the face of everything that had tried to unmake it. "Because it's right," he said simply. And for once there was nothing in his voice but the plain truth of it. And Emily believed him. She closed her hand around the wallet. "I'm going to Reverend Collins," she said. "Come with me." They were halfway up the bank when they heard the horses. Not one horse, several, moving fast and deliberate on the river road above. Emily reached the top of the bank and stopped. 3 riders, and behind them a wagon with 2 men on the seat. In the gray early light, she couldn't make out faces, but she recognized the broad silhouette in the lead position. Not Pratt. Thomas Whitman himself. She had not expected that. She'd expected Pratt, or Pratt's men, or a lawyer with documents. Thomas Whitman was 61 years old, had never in his adult life handled his own business disputes in person, and yet here he was on her road at first light. And that meant something had changed overnight, and she didn't yet know what. Jack went very still beside her. "Papa," he said, barely above a breath. Thomas Whitman pulled up 20 feet from them and looked at his son standing beside a 16-year-old girl at dawn, and the expression on his face was something Emily had no language for. Not anger, not surprise, but something older and colder and more certain than either. "You took my letters," Thomas said to his son, not a question. Jack said nothing. He was holding himself straight and still in the particular way of someone who has made a decision and is now experiencing the full weight of what that decision costs. "Those documents were taken from my private correspondence," Thomas said. His voice was completely level, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted. "Whatever you think you're doing, Jackson, you are exposing this family to—" "I'm exposing you," Jack said, "to the consequences of what you've actually done." Thomas Whitman looked at his son for a long moment. Then he turned his eyes to Emily, and they were the eyes of a man who had won every negotiation he'd ever entered by understanding exactly how much leverage he held. "Miss Harper," he said, "you are a minor who filed a fraudulent federal land claim. A single conversation with the right officials ends this today. You have nothing." Emily looked up at him. The morning was hot already, the air thick and dry, the kind of heat that sat on your chest and made everything harder. She thought about 66 degrees. She thought about the wallet in her hand. She thought about 6 women carrying timber down a riverbank before breakfast, because something wrong had been done, and they had decided it wasn't acceptable. She thought about her mother standing in the yard, not moving. She thought about the fact that she had moved. "Mr. Whitman," she said, "you are welcome to have that conversation with the officials. I have documentation of your correspondence with the assessor, your instructions to Gerald Pratt, and your involvement in a pattern of fraudulent land acquisition across multiple counties." She held up the wallet. "And in approximately 2 hours, Reverend Collins will have copies of everything in this wallet, along with sworn witness statements from 6 women in this town who watched your man destroy my property." She kept her voice steady. "So yes, you could pursue the false age issue."
and I could pursue all of the rest of it. And we could both spend a great deal of money and time in a fight that ends with one of us ruined." She paused. "Or you could call Gerald Pratt off and find another site for your mill expansion, and we could both go about our lives." Thomas Whitman's horse shifted beneath him. He held it still with an automatic precision. No one spoke. A full minute passed, the longest minute Emily Harper had lived since the morning she'd walked out her father's door. Then Thomas Whitman looked at his son, and something moved across the older man's face that Emily had not seen there before and did not entirely understand, except that it was not the expression of someone who had won. "Get off my land," he said. It took her one full second to understand he was talking to her. "Your land," she said, "has a filed claim on it in my name." "A fraudulent claim. One that will be tied up in proceedings for months while the documentation in this wallet becomes public record." She held his gaze. "Is that truly how you want to spend the rest of your summer, Mr. Whitman?" The second minute was shorter than the first. "Jackson," Thomas said, "come home." Jack didn't move. He was standing 6 inches from Emily's left shoulder, and he did not move a single inch. Thomas Whitman looked at his son, really looked at him, the way men sometimes look at something they raised and suddenly cannot recognize. And Emily saw the moment when the older man understood that something had changed that could not be unchanged, and that he had not been the one to change it, and that he was going to have to decide what to do with that. "Pratt will be withdrawn from this county by the end of the week," Thomas said. His voice had lost something, not its authority, but the certainty that authority had always been enough. "Whatever is in that wallet will not go further than Collins." Emily looked at him for a long moment. "And my claim?" she said. Silence. "Will stand," Thomas Whitman said, through a jaw that looked like it had been welded shut. He turned his horse and rode back up the road without another word. His men fell in behind him, and the sound of hooves on dry ground faded, and then there was nothing but the heat and the river and the prairie, and the two of them standing at the top of the bank above Emily's sod house. Jack let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for a very long time. "He'll make it difficult," he said, quietly and over time. "He doesn't forget." "I know." Emily looked down at the house, at the solid walls and the cedar roof, and the dark, cool interior visible through the open doorway. "Neither do I." She started down the bank. Behind her, after a moment, she heard Jack follow. The word spread the way all important things spread in Dunmore. Not through the newspaper, not through any official announcement, but through the particular network of women who talked to each other over garden fences and across dry goods counters, and through the walls of the Hensley boarding house, where sound traveled freely and nobody pretended otherwise. By the afternoon of the day Thomas Whitman rode away from Emily's land, 6 people knew. By evening, it was 14. By the following morning, when Emily came up the bank to fetch water from the town pump, 3 different women she barely knew stopped her on the main street to ask if it was true. "Is it true Whitman backed down?" "Is it true you had documents on him?" "Is it true his own son turned on him?" Emily answered each of them the same way, carefully, without embellishment, with exactly as much truth as was useful, and not one word more. Yes, the claim stood. Yes, Pratt was withdrawing. No, she didn't need anything. That last part was the only one any of them pushed back on. "Everybody needs something," said Ruth, the pastor's wife, falling into step beside her without invitation. She was a small woman with quick eyes and the unhurried manner of someone who had learned that patience was a more efficient tool than urgency. "The question is,
whether they're willing to say so out loud. "I appreciate that," Emily said. "Right now what I need is to finish weatherproofing the roof before the August rains." Ruth smiled like she knew that was only half an answer and was willing to wait for the rest. "Come to supper on Sunday," she said. "Just supper, nothing complicated." Emily started to decline and then stopped herself, because she had been declining things for 3 weeks now, and she was starting to understand that declining was a habit she'd developed to protect herself from people who wanted things from her, and that it had gotten tangled up somewhere along the way with declining things from people who just wanted to sit across a table from her. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." Ruth nodded once, like that was settled, and turned down a side street and was gone. She found Jack waiting at the river when she got back. He'd been there a while. His boots were dusty from the road, and he had the look of someone who had been working out what to say for longer than was probably useful. She climbed down the bank and went directly to her work, pulling the weatherproofing pitch from where she'd stored it against the east wall, and let him talk in his own time. "My father spoke to me last night," he said. She started working pitch into the roof seam. "What did he say?" "That I am no longer employed at the mill." He said it without drama, which told her it had cost him something to get to that place of steadiness. "That my room at the house is available to me through the end of the month. That after that, he would prefer I make my own arrangements." Emily kept working. "He moved fast." "He always does." Jack leaned against the wall, not helping, not leaving, just present in the particular way he'd developed over the past week. Close enough to be useful if needed, far enough to not crowd her. "I have $40 saved. I know how to manage horses, and I know the grain trade. There's a livestock operation north of Kingsley that's been looking for a yard foreman." "That's 40 miles away." "Yes." She stopped working and looked at him. His face was doing the thing it had started doing more often in the past few days, being honest without rehearsing at first, which made him look younger and considerably less certain, and, she had decided, far more trustworthy than the polished version of Jack Whitman she'd met 3 weeks ago on the bank above her. "Are you telling me you're leaving?" she said. "I'm telling you I'm figuring out what comes next." He met her eyes. "There's a difference." She held his gaze for a moment, long enough to decide something she hadn't quite decided yet, and then went back to work. "The Kingsley operation pays decent for a foreman position," she said. "If you know the manager, you should go in person rather than by letter. Men like that hire who they know, not who writes the best." A pause. "Is that advice?" "It's information. Do what you want with it." She heard him exhale. Not quite a laugh, but close. Emily Harper giving Jack Whitman advice on how to find work. He shook his head slowly. 3 weeks ago, I would have found that absurd." 3 weeks ago, you were absurd," she said, without looking up. "You've improved." This time, it was an actual laugh, short and genuine, and it surprised her into almost smiling. She kept her face on the pitchwork. "I want to help finish the weatherproofing before I go," he said. "You don't know how. Then show me." She looked at him over her shoulder. "Hand me that brush on the ground by your left boot." He picked it up without hesitation and brought it to her. She showed him. They worked through the afternoon, and somewhere in the third hour the silence between them changed quality, became less like two people being careful around each other, and more like two people who had gotten past the need for care and arrived somewhere more honest on the other side. He worked without complaint and without showing off, following her instruction without question, which she noted, because men who followed instruction without needing to first prove they'd already thought of it were rarer than they should have been. Around 4 in the afternoon, without preamble, he said, "What are you going to do with this place? Long term?"
She applied pitch to a seam and thought about how to answer that. There are 11 families in this county living in structures that get over 95 degrees inside during the day in July and August. 3 of them have children under 10. 2 have elderly members.
Last summer, one man died of heat sickness, and the inquest called it natural causes, because nobody wanted to say a man died of his own inadequate housing. Jack was quiet. A sod structure this size can be built for under $60 in materials, if you know what you're doing, and source the timber carefully. The labor is the main cost, and a community can provide labor if they know how. She paused. I'm going to offer to teach it. Teach people to build sod houses? Teach people to build cool houses. Sod, adobe, semi-subterranean, whatever the land and the budget support. It's not complicated if someone explains it right. She looked at the wall she'd built, solid and true, and still holding 66 degrees against a 100-degree afternoon. It's not complicated. It's just that nobody told them. Jack set down his brush. He was looking at her with the expression she'd started to recognize. The one where he was updating something in himself. Some assumption or half-formed idea about how the world worked, and didn't yet know what to replace it with. You planned this from the beginning, he said. Didn't you? Not just the house. All of it. She didn't answer right away. The truth was that she hadn't planned it. Not exactly. She hadn't walked out her father's door with a vision of building a teaching model and establishing herself as a resource for the county's most vulnerable residents. She'd walked out with $193 and the need to survive, and the knowledge that the earth held heat differently from the air above it. But somewhere between the first sod brick and the finished roof, something had shifted. Surviving alone had become surviving out loud. And surviving out loud had become something else. Something that involved other people's survival too, in ways she hadn't designed, but couldn't ignore. I planned the house, she said finally. The rest of it is just what the house made obvious. The trouble she hadn't anticipated came 3 days later, and it didn't come from Thomas Whitman. It came from her father. She was at the Saturday market. She'd started selling extra garden produce from the small plot she'd turned on the south side of the sod house. Squash and beans that were already coming in faster than she could eat them. When she looked up from her basket and found Robert Harper standing 10 feet away, watching her. He looked older than 3 weeks should have made a man look. He was wearing his good coat, which meant he'd prepared for this, which meant it wasn't an accident. Emily, he said. She stood up straight. Her hands were in her apron pockets where he couldn't see them, and she was grateful for that, because they had gone still and cold the moment she'd seen his face, and she didn't want him to know that. Papa, she said. He came closer, stopping at the edge of her market table, looking at the produce laid out on a cloth with an expression she couldn't immediately name. He picked up a squash, turned it over, set it down. It was such a familiar gesture. He'd always touched things when he was thinking, handled objects while he worked out words, that for a moment she was 9 years old and standing in his workshop watching him hold a tool he didn't know how to use. I hear you've been making quite a name for yourself, he said. I've been building a house and growing food, she said. I don't know what name that makes. Thomas Whitman is not a man who forgets. I know. Emily. He looked at her directly, and she saw the thing she'd been bracing for since she spotted him. Not anger, not authority, but something worse. Discomfort. The specific discomfort of a man who knows he has done wrong and is not quite ready to say so, but is also not quite able to pretend otherwise. I made a decision that I believed was practical. I know what Whitfield is. Her voice stayed level. A man who asked what I looked like before he asked my name. A man who told you his first wife was 14. A man you decided was an acceptable option for your daughter because he had 300 acres and you needed a practical solution. She paused. I understand the decision, Papa. I don't accept it. He was quiet. Around them the market moved. Voices, the creak of wagon wheels, the smell of fresh bread from the baker's stall. Your mother, he said. She asks about you. Emily felt something tighten in her chest. She knows where I am. She's not like you, Emily. She doesn't. He stopped, tried again. She didn't know how to go against me. She never has. I know that too. She looked at her father, really looked at him, the way she hadn't on the morning she'd left. He was a tired man, not a cruel one. Tired and limited and shaped by a world that had told him all his life that daughters were problems to be solved and that love looked like provision rather than permission. He was not the villain of her story. He was something sadder than that. A man who had loved her in the only language he knew, and in doing so, had nearly ended her. Tell Mama she can come see the house, Emily said. Her voice came out more gentle than she'd planned. Any time. The door is open. Her father looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face. Too complex to name, too honest to look away from. I'll tell her, he said. He picked up a squash from her table, set it down, picked it back up, put 3 coins on the cloth beside it. He walked away without another word. Emily stood at her table and breathed and let the market noise come back in around her and waited for her hands to warm back up. They took a while. Her mother came the following Tuesday. She came alone, in the early morning, while the air was still bearable, picking her way down the bank with the careful steps of someone navigating unfamiliar ground. Emily was inside when she heard the footsteps and went to the door. Margaret Harper stood at the threshold and looked at her daughter, and looked at the house, and looked at her daughter again. She was 51 and thin in the way of women who worked hard and worried harder, and she had the particular expression of someone trying to hold more feeling than their face had practiced managing. Come in, Emily said. Her mother stepped inside. She stood in the center of the single room and felt the temperature, felt it register, the same way Mrs. Palmer had felt it, the same way everyone felt it who came in from the 100-degree afternoon into the cool, earth-held air. Her mother pressed one hand flat against the sod wall, left it there. You built this, Margaret said. Yes, ma'am. Yourself? Mostly. I had help with the roof framing. Her mother looked at the wall her hand was against, and her throat moved. It's cool. 64 right now. It'll get to 66 by midday. Her mother didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she turned around and looked at Emily straight. And Emily saw what her mother's face looked like when it stopped managing itself and just felt something. And what it felt was grief, and pride, and something else that had no clean name, but lived in the space between those two. I should have said something, Margaret said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. When you left, I should have... Mama! Emily kept her voice steady. I know. I was afraid. Her mother looked at her hands. I have always been afraid, and I let that be a reason to be quiet when I should have... Mama! Emily crossed the room and took her mother's hands in both of hers, turning them over, holding them. Her mother's hands were rough and dry and familiar in a way that went deeper than words. You're here now. Her mother looked at her. Her eyes were bright and too full. I'm here now, she said. They stood like that for a long moment. 2 women in a cool room that one of them had built from nothing, holding on to something that had almost been lost, and wasn't, and deciding without words what to do with that. The heat broke in the third week of August the way it always broke. Not gradually, but all at once. A line of dark clouds coming in from the northwest at mid-afternoon that turned the sky the color of a bruise and dropped the temperature 15 degrees in 30 minutes. The rain that followed was straight and hard and real. The first significant rain since June, and it hit Dunmore like something the town had been owed for months. Emily was inside her sod house when it started, and she stayed inside and listened to it hit the packed earth roof and run off the sides and soak into the ground. And the walls didn't move. The roof held. The floor stayed dry. The temperature dropped to 59 degrees and stayed there, which was cool enough that she pulled her wool blanket around her shoulders and felt, for the first time in weeks, something close to comfortable. She was sitting like that, wrapped in her blanket, listening to the rain, when Mrs. Palmer knocked on the open doorframe, soaked through from the walk from town, holding a covered pot that steamed in the cooler air. "I brought soup," Mrs. Palmer said, in the tone of someone announcing something that did not require commentary. "Come in," Emily said. Mrs. Palmer came in, set the pot down, looked at the roof, listened to the rain working over it, and then looked at Emily with that expression that wasn't quite a smile. "Not a leak," she said. "Not one." She sat down on the earth bench, and they ate soup from the pot with 2 spoons while the rain came down outside, and the temperature stayed at 59, and the walls were solid on every side. After a while, Mrs. Palmer said, without preamble, "The Henderson woman came to see me." Emily looked up. "Martha Henderson, her boy Tommy, the one who had the heat sickness twice last summer?" She turned her spoon over. "She wants to know if you'll help her build." Emily set down her spoon. "Her plot isn't bottomland," Mrs. Palmer continued. "She's on higher ground, north edge of town. But the principle is the same. You go 3 feet down, bank the walls 2 feet thick, let the earth do the work." "Yes," Emily said, "the principle is the same. She doesn't have much money." "She doesn't need much. $60 all in if she can supply the labor." Mrs. Palmer looked at her steadily. "She has neighbors." "Then she has labor." Emily reached for her spoon again. "Tell her to come see me Thursday. We'll walk the plot together, and I'll show her what to look for in the soil." Mrs. Palmer made the sound that carried entire sentences and went back to her soup. Outside, the rain kept coming down on the roof that held, and Emily Harper sat in 62 degrees of cool air that she had pulled out of the earth with her own hands, and ate soup in the company of a woman who had brought cedar poles on the second day and stayed through everything that came after, and thought about Tommy Henderson, breathing easier through August, and thought about her mother's hands in hers, and thought about Jack Whitman learning to follow instruction, and thought about her father buying a squash. She did not think about what came next. There was time for that. Right now, there was just the rain and the soup, and the walls that held. Jack came by the following morning, which was clear and 20 degrees cooler than the day before. The air washed clean by the rain. The sky the particular sharp blue that only appeared after a real storm. He looked different, lighter somehow, like something that had been pressing on him for weeks had lifted along with the heat. "I'm leaving for Kingsley tomorrow," he said. "I got word they'll see me." "That's good," Emily said. He stood at the top of the bank, looking down at her, and she looked back up at him, and neither of them said for a moment what both of them were aware of, that this was a different kind of goodbye than either of them had expected when he'd first ridden out on his Palomino 3 weeks ago to watch a girl dig a hole in the ground. "I wasn't decent to you when we met," he said. "I want to say that plainly." "You weren't," she agreed. "You got better." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile exactly.
Something quieter than that.
Is that high praise from Emily Harper?
It's accurate praise, which is the only kind I give. He was quiet for a moment. All right, if that's all right. She considered that. It's all right, she said. He touched the brim of his hat, the first time he'd done it, she realized, in the way it was actually meant, with actual respect rather than performance. Take care of yourself, Miss Harper. I always have, she said. Safe travels, Mr. Whitman. He rode out. She watched him go until he was just a shape against the bright, clean morning, and then she turned back to the work that was waiting. The Henderson plot to survey, the second sod house to plan, the list of families who needed what she now knew how to build.
The ground was soft from the rain, and the air smelled of wet grass and distance, and everything that had to be done was still ahead of her. And she was 16 years old, with $62, a filed claim, and enough knowledge to change things for people who needed changing. She picked up her spade. She went to work. Martha Henderson was not what Emily had expected. She'd built a picture in her head from what Mrs. Palmer had told her. A tired woman, stretched thin by worry and doctor's bills, and a boy who got sick every summer without fail. And Martha Henderson was all of those things. But she was also the kind of woman who showed up to a Thursday morning meeting with a hand-drawn map of her property, precise measurements noted in the margins, and 3 questions written down on a folded piece of paper so she wouldn't forget them under pressure. Emily looked at the map for a long moment, and then looked at the woman who'd drawn it. You've been planning this, Emily said. Martha smoothed the map on the table between them with both palms.
Since last August. Since the second time Tommy couldn't keep water down, and I was sitting in the doctor's office listening to him tell me to keep the boy cool, as if I didn't know that, as if I hadn't been trying to do exactly that, with nothing to do it with. Her voice was steady, but something underneath it wasn't. I knew there had to be a way. I just didn't know what it was. Now you do, Emily said. Now I do. Martha looked at her directly. I have $42. I have 6 neighbors who've agreed to give Labor Days in exchange for me giving Labor Days on their projects when the time comes. And I have until the end of September before the weather turns. Emily looked at the map again. The plot dimensions were good. Better than good, actually. The north edge location Martha had mentioned gave her a natural slope to work with that would make the excavation easier than Emily's own site had been.
The soil composition in that part of the county tended toward dense clay loam, which held temperature even better than the river bottomland. You can do it in $40 if you're careful with the timber sourcing, Emily said. I know a man who sells dry-cured cedar offcuts from his fence post operation out near the Mill Road. He doesn't advertise them, but he'll sell. 3 cents per linear foot. She turned the map and marked 2 spots with her thumb. Here and here for your wall anchors. You want to go 4 feet down, given your soil type. You'll lose a foot of depth to floor tamping, but you'll gain it back in temperature stability. Martha was writing on her piece of paper before Emily finished speaking. When can you walk the plot with me? Martha asked. Thursday afternoon, Emily said. After the market. Martha folded her paper, folded her map, and stood up with the precise movements of someone who did not have time to waste and knew it. Thank you, she said. It came out fierce, almost defiant, like the gratitude was the last thing she'd expected to need, and she was giving it anyway. Don't thank me yet, Emily said. Wait until Tommy makes it through next August without getting sick. Martha Henderson's face did something complicated. I've been waiting 2 years for someone to tell me there was a way to make that happen, she said. I can wait a few more months. The survey walk happened Thursday, as planned, and by Friday morning, word had done what word always did in Dunmore. Traveled faster than any person could walk, and arrived in shapes its origin hadn't entirely intended. By Friday afternoon, Emily had 4 more requests. By Saturday evening, 7. She was sitting at her earth bench, going through the list. Names, plot locations, rough material estimates. When Mrs. Palmer came in, with the expression of someone who was not surprised, but had decided to behave as if she was, in order to give Emily the chance to be. "You're going to need help," Mrs. Palmer said. "I know that. More than Labor Day exchanges, actual systematic help. Coordination." She sat down. "You can't survey 7 plots and teach 7 families and source all the materials and manage all of it by yourself." "I know that too." Emily set down her list. "I've been thinking about Reverend Collins." Mrs. Palmer raised her eyebrows slightly. "Not for the physical work," Emily said. "For the organization. He has a church hall. He has a register of every family in the county. And he has exactly the kind of standing that makes people show up to meetings they'd otherwise avoid." She paused. "I can teach. I need someone who can convene." Mrs. Palmer looked at her for a long moment. "You are not a 16-year-old girl," she said finally. "You are something else, wearing a 16-year-old girl's clothing." "I'm a person who learned something useful and wants other people to not die of heat sickness," Emily said. "That's all this is." Mrs. Palmer made her sound. "Go talk to Collins." "I'm going in the morning." "Take your list." "I know to take my list." Reverend Collins read through the list twice. Then he set it on his desk and looked at Emily over the top of his folded hands, with the expression of a man who was revising an opinion he'd held for a long time. "7 families," he said. 7 so far. I expect more once the first builds are underway and people can see the results." "And your proposal is?" "Monthly building sessions. I teach the method in a morning demonstration, and then community labor teams rotate through each family's build over the following weeks. Every family who benefits agrees to give labor days to the next family's project. The cost stays under $50 per household in materials. The labor is shared." She watched his face. "It's not a charity program, Reverend. Nobody gets something for nothing. It's a trade system. People give what they have, which is time and labor, and they get back what they need, which is a house that won't kill them in August." Collins looked at his hands, then at the list, then at Emily. "There is a county welfare committee," he said slowly. "It has a budget, mostly unspent because the committee can't agree on what constitutes a legitimate community need versus personal responsibility." He paused. "I sit on that committee." Emily kept her face still. "How much is the budget?" $230. Annual. She did the math in her head fast. That would cover materials for 4 households completely. If the labor exchange covers the other 3 this cycle, by next year, the program is self-funding. Collins was quiet for a long moment. "There are men on that committee," he said carefully, "who have opinions about young women proposing large-scale plans." "I imagine there are." She held his gaze. "Is that a reason not to bring it to them?" He looked at her for one more moment. Then he opened his desk drawer and took out a clean sheet of paper and a pen. "Let's write the proposal," he said. They presented it to the Welfare Committee on a Wednesday evening, and the first 10 minutes went exactly the way Emily had expected. 2 of the 5 men on the committee spending that time asking Collins questions that were actually directed at Emily, but delivered at Collins because she was 16 and a girl, and they had not yet built the reflex to speak to her directly. She let it go on for exactly 10 minutes. Then she said, "Gentlemen, I'm sitting right here." The room went quiet. The man who'd been asking Collins the most questions, a dry goods merchant named Alderman Fitch, who had the self-possessed look of someone accustomed to being the most practical person in any room, turned and looked at her properly for the first time since she'd sat down. "Miss Harper," he said. "Mr. Fitch?" She put her proposal on the table,
and slid it to the center where all of them could see it.
The families on that list spent last summer paying doctor's fees they couldn't afford for conditions that were caused by preventable heat exposure. This proposal prevents the exposure. The cost is $210 from a committee budget that currently sits at $230. She let that settle. The question is not whether you can afford to do this. The question is whether you can explain why you didn't. Alderman Fitch looked at the proposal, then at Collins, then back at Emily. "How do we know it works?" he said. "Come to my house," she said. "Any day this week. Step inside and feel the temperature. It's holding 64 degrees as of this morning. Bring a thermometer if you don't believe me." She paused. "Bring your wife. She'll believe the thermometer." Something moved across Fitch's face. Not quite amusement, but the recognition of someone who had just met a mind that operated differently from what he'd been expecting, and wasn't entirely sure what to do about that. The vote was 4-1 in favor. The one dissenter was a man named George Pullum, who said afterward to the man beside him, loud enough that Emily heard it clearly, that it was a fine program as long as that Harper girl understood her role was technical advice and not leadership. Emily filed that information away and said nothing. The check was written for $210. She walked out of the church hall with it in her hand and stood in the warm evening air and looked at the sky and took one long, slow breath. Then she went home and started planning the first build. The Henderson house broke ground 2 weeks later. 23 people came for the first Labor Day, more than Emily had organized for, which meant reorganizing on the fly, which meant standing in front of a group of adults twice her age and redirecting labor teams without apologizing for it. She did it the way she'd done everything since the morning she'd left her father's house, with precision and without performance. Tommy Henderson was there, which had not been part of the plan. He was 7 years old and small for it, with the thin, watchful face of a child who had learned early that the world could become dangerous without warning. He stood at the edge of the site with his hands in his pockets and watched Emily mark the excavation corners with stakes and cord. After a while, he came over and stood beside her. "Is this really going to work?" he asked. Emily looked at him. "Yes," she said, simply, without qualification, the way she wished someone had spoken to her when she was small and uncertain and needed to know if things could actually get better. Tommy looked at the stakes, at the cord, at the group of adults with their shovels lined up along the excavation line. "How do you know?" he said. "Because I built one, and I slept in it all summer, and it was 64 degrees when everything outside was over 100. She handed him the measuring cord. "You want to help hold this end?" He took it with both hands, held it straight without being told. "Good," she said. "Right there. Don't move." He didn't move. The twist came from a direction Emily had stopped watching, which was always how the important things arrived. Her father came to the Henderson build. He appeared at the edge of the site on the second Labor Day, standing back from the work, wearing his work clothes rather than his good coat this time, which meant something different from the Saturday market meeting. Meant he hadn't prepared a version of himself in advance, but had just come. He watched for almost an hour before Emily noticed him. She finished the instruction she was giving to the Carlyle brother on the sod cutting technique, then crossed the site to where her father stood. "Papa," she said. "Emily." He looked at the excavation, now 4 feet deep, 8 feet by 12, the walls already showing their first course of bricks, the cedar frame laid out and ready. He looked at the 20 people working without direction, each one knowing their role, the whole thing moving with a kind of organic efficiency that came from genuine investment rather than supervision. "You organized all of this," he said. "Yes."
He was quiet for a moment. The committee money. $210, covering material costs for 4 households this cycle. The Henderson house is first. She watched his face. Tommy Henderson spent 2 summers getting heat sickness in a tin-roofed house his family can't afford to replace. He won't spend the third. Her father turned a piece of wood over in his hands. He'd picked it up from the material pile without seeming to notice. The gesture was so familiar it made her chest ache. "I told Whitfield the arrangement was off," he said, not looking at her. "A month ago. After—" He stopped. "After I understood what I'd done." Emily kept her face even. "What made you understand?" He looked at the wood in his hands.
Your mother came home from your house, and she didn't say a word for 2 days. Just went about her business. And on the 3rd day, she sat down at dinner, and she said to me, very quietly, that she had felt the walls of what you'd built, and that she had been ashamed. He paused. Not of you. Of us. The words landed carefully in the space between them. I didn't know what shame could feel like, he said, until she said that. I've been calling it practicality, and calling it protection, and calling it everything but what it was. He finally looked at her. It was fear. I was afraid of what would happen to you in a world that doesn't... He stopped again. But you already knew what would happen, and you went anyway. Emily looked at her father, this tired, limited man who had loved her in the wrong direction for 16 years and was standing on a building site in his work clothes trying to learn a different language. I know, she said, quiet. Not forgiving him exactly. That would take longer, and she knew it, and she suspected he did too. But acknowledging, taking what was true in what he'd said, and not throwing it away just because the source was complicated. I'd like to help, he said, if there's work I can do. She studied him for a moment. Then she pointed at the material pile. There's a stack of sod bricks that need moving to the east wall line. They need to be set with the grass side down, not up. You'll know you've got the wrong side if the surface is rough. He looked at the pile, back at her. Something moved through his eyes that she didn't have a name for yet. Grass side down, he said. Grass side down. He went to work. Emily watched him pick up the first brick, turn it over, check the surface, set it correctly, and reach for the next one. She watched him do it 3 times to make sure he had it. Then she went back to her own work. The Henderson house was finished in 11 days. On the 12th day, Martha Henderson took Tommy inside for the first time. Emily was there. She'd been doing the final temperature check, walking the perimeter for any wall weakness, making sure the roof seal had held through the light rain 2 days before. She was on her way out when Martha and Tommy came through the door. The boy stopped 2 steps in. He stood very still, and Emily watched him feel it, the temperature dropping around him, the cool earth air, the solid walls on every side. He put both of his small hands flat against the sod wall the same way his mother had done, the same way Mrs. Palmer had done, the same way everyone did when they stepped inside for the first time and understood in their body what their mind hadn't quite believed. "Mama?" he said. His voice was quiet with something too big for a 7-year-old's vocabulary. "I know, baby," Martha said. Tommy turned and looked at Emily, with eyes that were too bright and a face that was working very hard to hold itself together. "Thank you," he said. Emily had heard those words from adults in the past weeks. Careful, measured, freighted with their own histories of needing and not asking. Hearing them from a 7-year-old who said them the way children said things, without armor and without strategy, simply and completely, she had to look away for a moment. She looked at the wall, at the floor, at the cedar roof frame above her head, solid and exactly right. 63 degrees, she said, when she had herself back. Probably dropped to 61 tonight.
You'll want that blanket from the hook by September. Tommy nodded like this was the most important instruction he'd ever received. 61, he said seriously. 61, Emily confirmed. The letter from Jack arrived 6 weeks after he'd left for Kingsley. 3 pages, written in a hand that was neater than she'd expected from a man who'd spent his life having other people do his paperwork. He had the foreman position. The operation was solid. The work was harder than he'd anticipated, and he had learned more about horses in 6 weeks than in the previous 3 years. He did not write about his father. He did not write about Dunmore or what he'd left behind. He wrote about the work, which told her more about who he was becoming than any amount of reflection would have. At the end of the 3rd page, he wrote, "I think about 66 degrees more than is probably sensible. Take care of yourself, Miss Harper." She read it twice, folded it carefully, and put it in the tin box with her filing receipt and the $47 she had left. Then she picked up her pen and wrote back. She told him about the Henderson house and Tommy's face when he felt the temperature. She told him about the committee vote and Alderman Fitch's wife, who had indeed come with a thermometer and had indeed believed it. She told him about her father moving sod bricks with the grass side down on a Tuesday morning without being asked twice. She told him about the 4 more builds scheduled for September and the 2 families who'd already agreed to give Labor Days toward the October builds in exchange. She did not tell him she had read his letter twice. At the end of her own letter, she wrote, 66 degrees changes things for people who need them changed. I'm glad you know what that feels like. She sealed it and addressed it to Kingsley, and put it on the outgoing mail stack, and went back to work. September came in cool and forgiving, the brutal heat finally releasing its hold on the county with something almost like apology. The 3 September builds went up one after another. The Briggs structure on the south end, the young Calloway family out on the East Road, and a small emergency build for a widow named Frances Doyle, who had been managing a tar paper lean-to for 3 summers and had not told anyone because she was ashamed of it, until Ruth, the pastor's wife, found out and told Emily directly. Frances Doyle's build took 9 days and cost $41. On the day it was finished, Frances stood in the doorway for a full minute without speaking. Then she said, in a voice that came from somewhere very deep, "I have lived in this county for 22 years, and nobody has..." She stopped. Mrs. Palmer, who was standing nearby, said quietly, "You don't have to finish that sentence, Frances." Frances Doyle looked at Emily. "How did you know," she said, "that it would work, before you ever built the first one? How did you know to trust what you'd only read into and not yet seen?" Emily thought about that question. The honest answer had several parts, and the deepest part of it was this: that she had trusted because she'd had no alternative, and that necessity had forced her past the point where doubt was useful, and that sometimes the best way to know a thing is true is to have no option but to act as though it is. But there was something else underneath that, something truer. "I was more afraid of going back," Emily said, "than I was afraid of being wrong." Frances Doyle looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, with the slow certainty of someone who had just heard a sentence that explained something they had wondered about for a very long time. On the last day of September, Emily Harper turned 17. Nobody knew the date except her mother, who came in the early morning with a jar of honey and 2 biscuits wrapped in cloth, and sat at the earth bench and didn't say much, and didn't have to. They ate biscuits with honey in 62 degrees while the September morning warmed itself up outside, and Margaret Harper held her daughter's hand across the small table and looked at the walls around them with the expression Emily had seen on her face since the first Tuesday visit. Not quite peace, but moving in that direction. "Your father," Margaret said carefully, "is proud of you. He doesn't know how to say it yet." "I know, Mama. He's learning. I know that too." Margaret squeezed her hand, said nothing else. Sometimes nothing else was the right thing. Later that morning, Mrs. Palmer arrived with a practical gift, a proper measuring tape, the good kind with a brass fitting, to replace the knotted cord Emily had been using since the beginning. She put it on the table without ceremony. "For the October bills," she said. "Thank you, ma'am," Emily said. Mrs. Palmer sat down and looked at her steadily. "7 bills by end of October," she said, "if the schedule holds." "It'll hold. 41 families in this county still living in structures that will be dangerous again next July." "I know." Emily ran her thumb along the measuring tape. "One at a time." Mrs. Palmer nodded. Then, with the tone of someone making a simple observation, "A year ago you was sleeping in a trench." "A year ago I was sleeping in a trench and had $193 and a spade." Emily looked at the walls of her house, at the solid earth that had held all summer and was still holding, at the cedar roof that had been wrecked once and rebuilt stronger, at the floor she had tamped with her own feet on the 4th day and hadn't had to touch since. "Now I have the same spade, $47, a measuring tape, and 7 finished buildings." "And 41 to go," Mrs. Palmer said. "And 41 to go," Emily agreed. She picked up the measuring tape, stood up, looked at the door of the house she had built from nothing at 16 years old, with 2 bleeding hands and the absolute certainty that the earth held heat differently from the air above it, and that the difference was enough to build a life on. "Then I'd better get started," she said. She walked out the door into the cool September morning, and she went to work, and she did not look back. Emily Harper had been thrown away at 16 years old with $200 and a flour sack, and she had taken that and turned it into cool walls for 41 families who needed them. And the earth had held every degree of it, and it would keep on holding. That was what she had built. Not just a house, a proof. That one clear-eyed person, willing to dig when others watched, willing to stand when others retreated, willing to teach what she had learned in the hardest school there was, could change the temperature of an entire town. And no one, not her father, not Thomas Whitman, not Gerald Pratt, not the combined weight of every voice that had told her to be reasonable and go home, no one could take 62 degrees away from her.